My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Today we're joined by author Ron Peterson Jr. to talk to us about his book, Under the Trestle, the 1980 Disappearance of Gina Renee Hall and Virginia's first no-body murder trial. Ron, welcome to Mind Over Murder.
Thank you, Kristin, and thanks, Bill. It's great to be with you today.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please, professionally?
Sure. I'm originally from the Hampton Roads area. Currently live in the Smithfield area. I'm married with two kids. And I went to Radford University, attended Radford, which is where Gina Hall went at the time of her disappearance and death. Several years after her, it would have been in the mid-'80s. Was a journalism major, and then worked as a writer for a period of time, and then got sidetracked, worked in advertising, both in a newspaper and television advertising environment. Kept writing the whole time. I had written one other book, which there was not a very big market for. In the back of my mind, I knew about this story about Gina Hall, and I guess like anyone, and have a good nose for an untold story, and set out in writing the book. Have been really happy with the result.
We were both really enjoying it. What is it about Gina's murder that was so important to you that you needed to tell the story in book form?
It was about 84 or 85 when I first heard about it, as though her murder happened in 1980. And the rumor at Radford University, it was what we call an urban myth nowadays, was that there was a former student who had been murdered who was buried somewhere on or around the campus or around the New River Valley in, Radford, Blacksburg, that area. I thought nothing of it, thought it was just a kind of an urban myth. One of my roommates, who happened to be a criminal justice major, one day told me about a lecture he had in a criminal justice class when the professor lectured about the Gina Hall murder case, that her killer had been convicted of first-degree murder without the body. And at the time, that was the first time that had happened in Virginia without a body, confession, or an eyewitness, and one of the first few times in the country. Then he went on to say that she was believed to be buried in a clandestine grave somewhere around there. I guess a good murder mystery captures our interest. As I got older, and left Radford, stuck in the back of my mind. I started to think of her more as you get older, you have kids, you think, what if something like that happened to your daughter? Mm-hmm. And happened to cross paths with some people that knew her, that from her hometown of Coburn, Virginia, out in the western part of the state. We just talked about what a great person she was, what a wonderful family she came from, as well as running into a few people that knew her murderer, Stephen Epperly, who told quite the opposite story about him. Then over the years, the next 20, 30 years, when the internet era rolled around, I'd find myself Googling her name, hoping that her remains had been found. Yeah, closure is an overused word, and I know, Bill, certainly with your situation with your sister, you know that. I guess the term is resolution. I was hoping there would be some resolution for Gina's family. Hadn't been. And then after a while, my wife said, hey, you ought to write a book about that, because I would talk about the case all the time and share it with people who would then do internet research and be amazed by it. Started writing a book, and it took me about 2 years to put it all together, and finally did.
Oh, we're both smiling. I'm thinking of your wife saying, in your copious free time, I think you should write a book. So how did your skill set as a journalist help you in crafting the book? It's a significant amount of research.
Yeah, and what I found, it was just a matter of calling people. Probably 90% of the interviews that I did, the initial contact was over the phone. A lot of them I'd travel in and sit down with them to talk. I found, for whatever reason around this case, people were more than willing to talk about it. Anybody who has a background in journalism likes to think they can ask good questions and the tough questions. And we see TV interviews where they're doing that. But what I found was just, I'd get people started talking about it. For example, Everett Shockley, the attorney that prosecuted the case. He would share all kinds of information. It was just asking him the routine questions that any journalist or any writer would, or even that you would in a conversation with someone that would found something interesting. And then it was pretty cool that so many people I talked to would say, well, hey, you need to talk to this person as well. And then they would give me an introduction, an entree to that person, which really helped quite a bit.
But there have to be some pretty significant challenges in taking all of those different sources and distilling all of that information into a book. What were some of those challenges that you found yourself having to deal with during that process?
I would say the trial, the trial went over 6 days, condensing all of that into a third of the book, which it takes up like an episode of Law and Order. If you've ever watched that show, the original Law and Order, the longest running show on television, it starts with an introduction of the characters, and you learn about the crime, and then the prosecutors get involved, and then the case goes to court. It was a matter of just finding the highlights of each part of that, telling that story. But probably the hardest part, the trial transcript is on the public record. It's available at the State Library of Richmond because it was a landmark case with the nobody murder conviction. So it was a matter of spending a couple days reading through that and listening to that, and then trying to pick the highlights for each witness from the trial.
It's a fascinating case. So with the 100+ people that you ended up talking to, did you have contact with the Hall family?
I did. Early on, I got in contact with Gina's sister, Dilley Hall, who she was living with at the time of her murder. She was living with in Radford. Delaney was a graduate student there at Radford University. I just asked if it was okay if I did that, and if she'd have told me this is something the family and I want to just forget and put behind us, I'd rather you didn't, then I wouldn't have. She was in a position where she really wanted to have some light shined on her sister's case, in large part because her remains had not been found. She was very supportive. Over the past year, she and I have probably talked or been in contact about once a week or, several times a week, either, on the phone or social media, or I've met her in person several times out in that part of the state. From the Hall family, she is the one who's been the most active and out in the forefront. Still similar in a lot of ways to you with your sister who was murdered in the Colonial Parkway murders, but she's been really the biggest advocate for her sister.
And I know with these cases like the Colonial Parkway murders that stretch on for decades, like ours has, and of course, like Gina's has, you end up dealing with the siblings of the lost loved one because in many cases the parents are gone.
Exactly. And that's the case with her as well. Gina's father, John Hall, who by every account was just an outstanding person, was a really good former Virginia Tech football player, among other things, and also a State Farm insurance agent who was really well known around the state. Unfortunately, he died with no resolution as far as what happened to his daughter's remains.
It's very sad. Do you know if Delana actually ever sat down and read the book? Was she able to get through it?
I think she has read parts of it. Interestingly, she has written a book of her own that came out over the past year. It's called The Miraculous Journey. She was actually getting started on it when I first met with her. Different from mine in that a lot of it is her emotional and spiritual journey over the last 40 years. She started for years. She really couldn't talk about it and just avoided talking about her sister or what had happened. Then over the course of time became more and more interested and involved, and has actually in recent years has spent a lot of time following up on leads and actually out looking and digging and looking for a clandestine grave. So she's come to several of the book signings that we've had for the book and presentations that we've given.
I was wondering about that. Now, is she comfortable, for instance, if you're in a bookstore or what have you, would you introduce her to people? Would you say that she was in the room?
We sure have. Yes, indeed. She's very willing to do that. She has done, in promoting her book, she's also done some appearances on her. She's on social media. If anyone's on Facebook, she's easy to find. Her name's Dilley Hall Bodmer, and the site for her book, it's called The Miraculous Journey. She is more than willing to talk about it. This past summer had a candlelight vigil in Radford for Gina, where she got up and gave a presentation. Yeah, I think she, especially in recent years, has become increasingly comfortable in talking with folks about it.
I think that's wonderful. And it's funny, I feel like maybe our journeys were a bit in parallel there because listening to the things that Delena's gone through and getting more comfortable speaking out and so on, very similar.
So you'd mentioned that Delana has actually reached a point where she feels like she can follow up on leads, which I think is excellent. Have there been any leads of interest that you can talk about that have come up as a result of the book?
There have been quite a few on my end. One was a person who back in 1980 thought he saw Steve Epperly along the New River, and I'll just talk in general terms, but doing something that could have been related to disposing of her body would have been the night after the murder. State police resources were brought in to look for that, as well as a few other sites. There are several leads I've forwarded to the state police that they handle and don't necessarily give a lot of feedback on. And then there was another family that owns a farm property in that part of the state, the New River Valley, where Delana actually went out and did some searching there. It's interesting, in recent months, Delana's worked with a doctor, and I won't get into him a lot, but his name is Dr. Arpad Vass, V-A-S-S. He's a forensic anthropologist, has patented a device which he uses to find clandestine graves. It's somewhat controversial. There's some people in law enforcement that are skeptical of it, but others that really support it. Delana has worked closely with him, actually going to some sites with him using the device, and then also with cadaver scenting dogs.
Yeah, I've heard from people in law enforcement that are in favor of this technology and others that are pretty skeptical. So I've heard reviews that go both ways on that one. You interviewed so many people. Besides Stephen Epperly, were there other interviews that you wanted but didn't get?
There were some friends that were close to him, and I won't mention their names. It's in the book, and they're certainly on public record, and they were spoken about in the trial. I would have liked to have talked to them. For them, it's a difficult chapter in their life as well. So I definitely would have liked to have talked to the people that were Epperly's friends, that were in his circle of friends at the time of the murder and the night of the murder. Like I said, they declined. And then you're probably going to ask about Stephen Epperly himself. I did try to contact him. Protocol is someone in prison, you have to send them a letter to get in contact. Did not hear back, and I verified that he had received the letter. And then I tried to go through his sister. One of his two sisters is probably, in terms of family members, the closest one to him and visits him fairly often in prison. She passed along a message from me that I wanted to have a chapter of the book in which he would tell his story. If he had an alternate theory or something like that, he could express that. But he declined. I think any journalist or newspaper reporters or even television reporters in the years after the murder, pretty negative, and for good reason, toward him. And I think because of that, he was reluctant to talk to anybody.
If you were, for some reason or another, able to get an interview with him, I know that you have a film project coming up. What are the key pieces of information that you'd like to get from him, other than the location of Gina's body, of course?
I've heard from law enforcement officers who have interviewed him that he's adamant that he was framed, that everybody that was involved in the case in law enforcement framed him, and to hear him explain that, as well as talk about any other alternate theory he would have. Yeah, that would probably be one of the things that I'd want to ask him.
I'm so glad that the sound of me rolling my eyes is not something that will show up. Because if you read the book, and I'm not saying you set out to bury him, but when you lay out the facts, I actually found myself saying out loud, reading the book, and I really enjoyed it. I found myself saying, I'm not sure we need a body here. In other words, of course, it would be great if we could find Gina's remains. But as you go through all of the circumstantial evidence, it's significant. There's blood and fiber and significant evidence that a violent act took place. I do have to remind folks when I talk about the Colonial Parkway murders, which is 1986 to 89, that DNA hadn't come out of the lab yet in 86. In 1980, there might have been a few academic papers about this thing called DNA, but they certainly weren't using it in any kind of forensic capacity. In this case, were they?
They were not. No, it was identified Gina Hall's blood as type O blood, and that's what the criminologist testified to in court with regard to the blood evidence.
But that was a limit of where you could go with blood evidence back then.
It was, yeah. And it's fortunate that there was so much other circumstantial evidence. And I spoke with a few jury members who said as much as anything, some of the statements he made, and he never confessed, but there were, I think, what an attorney would call an implied, when he said things that an innocent person would not say. So there were 4, maybe 5 examples that were presented in testimony and that Everett Shockley referenced in his closing arguments that I think helped the jury reach a guilty verdict.
Oh, some of these comments that he made early on to friends and people that I think he thought might be supportive in terms of him trying to seek legal counsel and so on. The things that he said just made him sound so incredibly guilty.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
This remark about what happens if they can't find the body in the early stages, I just about fell out of my chair.
Absolutely. He goes to that guy's house. Bill Cranwell was his name, to get his advice. Cranwell was an older guy, was a successful businessman, but was also savvy about law. His brother was a prominent attorney, Richard Cranwell, who was a state senator. As you said, after he asked him, he says, "Hey, when you get a chance, ask your brother if they can do anything to me if they don't find her body." And Cranwell couldn't believe what he said. But then the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, that the big coincidence was that Bill Cranwell was a college roommate and good friend of Gina Hall's father, John Hall. So he was obviously obligated to report that comment to the police, and ended up being the last witness in the trial.
For the benefit of our younger listeners, I'm going to explain the Paul Harvey reference.
You're going to have to, actually.
So Paul Harvey was this longtime newsman with a very kind of quirky delivery, kind of talked like, and that's the rest of the story. He would set up an interesting news story, there'd be a commercial break, and then he'd come back and he would tell you the rest of the story. And he was a very quirky, kind of Midwestern sounding guy, not a classic broadcaster type voice, but a fantastic storyteller. And so now, because Kristin teases me about making references like that, so I thought we better explain who Paul Harvey is.
And honestly, my dad listens to Paul Harvey all the time, but I don't think I would have known that reference either, honestly.
For your benefit, Ron, we were talking about Gina's case, and we were talking about 1980 and her going dancing, and I was referencing the disco era, and I said something to Kristin, my partner in podcasting here, about her remembering the disco era, and then she reminds me, no, she was 3 years old or something.
I was a year old in 1980. I was a year old in 1981. So no, I don't remember disco.
I was humbled.
As you should have been.
Yes.
That I was the only one that remembered the disco era.
Wow. And it's interesting, at this point, 1980, and I think I referenced that in the book, but it was the tail end of the disco era. The soundtrack from Saturday Night Fever was still lingering on the charts.
That's right.
So,
that album had a successful multi-year run. And by the way, for Kristin's benefit, albums are these big square, 12 by 12, and they have a record. It's a flat piece of plastic inside.
So those are coming back in.
I know.
Actually, vinyl is coming back. Right. A number of my students actually have vinyl, and I'm shocked and awed at that.
Yeah, my 21-year-old son, Chris, thinks my Rega turntable that I bought in London years ago and my thousands of record albums are very cool now, so I feel somewhat vindicated.
Oh, my God.
Oh, that's great.
Wow. So turning back to Gina just for a second, and I know you and I have talked about this off the air, but I do want to go ahead and get you on the record here. Where do you think Gina Renee Hall's remains are?
Law enforcement folks that work the case, there are just dozens of different theories, but what I believe is that the night of the murder, which it was Saturday night, early Sunday morning, somewhere on the route between the lake and the town of Radford, that Stephen Epperly, for lack of a better word, hid the body or put it in a shallow grave somewhere just to get it out of the trunk of the car until he could collect his wits. And then he didn't become a suspect for another another 48 or more hours until he was officially a suspect. So he had that time to go back and get the body, perhaps with an accomplice. One of the things the book points out is his car was not reliable. It was June and he had a radiator that would overheat. So I'm thinking if he did, maybe he used someone else's car or they came with him. And then at that point, maybe it could have been the Sunday, the Monday, or the Tuesday before the search had really started for her in that area. He picked up the body and took it perhaps to a remote location. He was a big hunter. He hunted on a lot of private land in the outlying counties around Radford and Blacksburg, out in Montgomery County, Giles County, Floyd County, just really mountainous, remote areas that he knew really well. So I think there's a chance he took the body somewhere like that and buried it somewhere that he knew would not be developed, that would remain rural land. I think that's her final resting place, and that would be extremely difficult to find, taking into account how remote that part of the state still is. I do have to say that's just kind of my theory, what I know about him and what I've heard from other people that investigated the case, as well as people that search for clandestine.
That's funny because I feel like they did so much searching in Radford on both banks of the New River and the river itself, the lake. It just seems so likely that a guy like Epperly, with his history as an outdoorsman and all of this hunting experience that he had, maybe that Sunday or Monday, could have found the time and, as you said, have gone out to a much more remote area of the state and buried the body. And that way, all of this searching that took place that was much closer by to where the car was found is for naught, because the body is many miles away, could be in a cave or any number of hiding places that would be unlikely. And as you said, you're talking about a beautiful but remote area of the state.
We've been talking about the Alexis Murphy case, and she also is a nobody case. Her murderer, Randy Taylor, was convicted without having her body present. But we were also remarking the other day when we were talking about the Alexis Murphy case that the area that she went missing from, it is also remote. There's a lot of places that you can hide a body. So despite a huge search for her as well, she also has not been located. And it's just, it's very striking. There are so many places that you can hide a body in the more remote regions of Virginia.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
You asked me earlier about Epperly, and there were two things I generally like to mention when that topic comes up. One is just by every account, and again by people that have interviewed him, police officers and psychologists, what a narcissist he is, just with an inability to feel any sympathy or empathy for what her family has gone through. He's just not capable of it. And then two, I think a simple way of looking at it is he has told this lie for so long that he actually now he might believe that he is innocent because he's told the same lie for so long. And I think a person can tell a lie so often that before long they come to believe it. And I think a lot of it is just that simple.
Yeah, we've talked about this regarding Randy Taylor too. I was saying the other day that I think for most of us that are somewhere on the moral spectrum between good and evil, but let's say a little bit more towards the good side, it is very difficult for those of us that try to be respectful of other people or have a conscience or do good and worthwhile things. It's very difficult for us to understand that for someone like Epperly or Randy Taylor, who were probably well on their way to the sociopath, very dark side of the human psyche, it's really difficult for us to understand that when someone's going to be in jail for the rest of their lives, that they even then couldn't find their way clear to telling law enforcement, their captors really, something that might benefit the family. It's always baffled me.
Absolutely. It is baffling.
So we understand that you're working on a documentary with filmmaker Scott McTavish. And now Scott says it's okay to talk about it. So what can you tell us about the project?
Yeah, and in fact, he has not made an official announcement yet. So I was waiting on that, before I started. But yeah, I spoke with him as well, and he said it was fun to talk about it. But yeah, Under the Trestle is in development as a documentary. Scott McTavish and McTavish Pictures, as you probably know, has a background producing feature-length documentaries. Probably the most noteworthy was several years ago, a documentary called Murph the Protector about Michael Murphy, who was the Navy SEAL that the story Lone Survivor was based on. But he did a documentary about Murph's life, which was just outstanding. And this is among Scott's other work and other films he's done. Murph Protector was shortlisted for an Academy Award in several Academy Award nominations in several categories. Scott got into contact with me shortly after the book came out. He happens to be from the New River Valley area originally when he was young, wanted to bring Gina Hall's story to the screen. One of the things that we're talking about is true crime is so big on the streaming services, on Amazon, Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, HBO, all those services. It seems like there's new ones popping up all the time. They are always looking for true crime content. So we talked about either what they would call a 4x60 or a 4x90, which would be 4 episodes. So this story could potentially start with the first episode being the bio of Gina Hall and of Stephen Epperly, the good, the bad, the angel and the devil kind of thing, which is parallel that a lot of people make. And then the second one being the night of the murder, what happened then, some of the questions that still remain. The third episode being the trial, certainly one of the most fascinating trials of the 20th century in Virginia or even in the country. And then the fourth being, where is Gina? It would pick up with the search for her remains. I think anyone who's read the book would feel that would make for a compelling documentary series. And then what's been an interesting thing is one thing I've done since the book came out over the past year in 2019, we did a lot of lectures with the people that were involved in the case. Everett Shockley, the prosecutor, Austin Hall, who is the lead investigator, as well as Epperly's 2 defense attorneys, Woody Lookabill and Dave Warburton, who were all gracious enough to come out and give lectures on the case, with me. But we met a lot of people who filled in some blanks, people that have come forward that knew Gina, who shed a light on some of the things, and even a couple of people who served time in prison with Epperly, who have who we got to know, who attended an event for the book and would share vignettes and stories that would, I think would really be fascinating in the documentary, then as well as some of the leads in the search for Gina, which obviously have not come to fruition, but were fascinating in that respect. We're looking, hopefully by mid-year or toward the end of the year, Scott will actually get underway with that, and I'm looking forward to it.
We were talking, Kristin and I were talking about this case and about your book, and one of the things that Kristin said was, this is such a fascinating case, but it takes a while to really lay out everything that happened and the way the evidence came together and so on. And it's funny, I commented the other day when we were prepping for this conversation, I said, I'm not sure they can do this in an hour-and-a-half documentary. Uh-huh. So I think the 4x60 limited television series could be a great format. This is a show I would very much like to watch.
Yeah, well, thank you.
So your audience is building as we speak.
I know that you, in addition to the documentary, you do have another project that you've been working on that's about to come out, and that is your newest book, Chasing the Squirrel. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for asking. In one of my first interviews, as I was talking with Austin Hall, again, he's a retired state police officer who was the lead investigator in the Gina Hall case. But Austin and I were having lunch, and he said, hey, if this book turns out all right, I've got another case for you to write about. And I said, oh, really? What's that? He proceeded to tell me this fascinating story. It's amazing because it happened in this same area in the New River Valley in Southwest Virginia. In the 70s and 80s, there was a drug smuggling pilot by the name of Wally Thrasher, who was this really charismatic, larger-than-life, almost like a Burt Reynolds kind of character. He was a daredevil pilot. He would fly plane loads of drugs, mostly marijuana, from South America and the Caribbean, first into Florida, but then when Florida got too hot with drug interdiction and the feds, he would fly the drugs straight into Virginia, where they were then distributed up north to northern states. But he did it throughout the 70s and 80s, which was just tremendous longevity for a drug smuggler. His nickname was the Squirrel. And
where does the nickname come from?
Well, he was elusive. He was able to scurry away from trouble like a squirrel. He originally got the nickname on the football field in high school, interestingly enough. As the 80s went on, another part of the story is his wife. Her name was Olga Thrasher. She was Portuguese-born, really attractive, outgoing wife. So in 84, finally, the state police got the evidence to move forward and indict him when a plane he had crashed into Fancy Gap Mountain.
Don't you
with
hate
one of his pilots on board.
Don't you hate when that happens?
Yeah, full of marijuana, all burnt, just about all of it burnt to a crisp. And
did this poor pilot survive or not?
There were two pilots on the plane. One miraculously survived, and the other was killed.
Oh.
But then when the feds moved forward, then the federal authorities got involved, the DEA and Department of Justice. But Wally Thrasher faked his own death in Belize in another plane crash. There was a fake death certificate, and authorities later came to learn the crash was staged. He made it look like his body was.
What a great story! This is unbelievable.
Yeah.
If you were writing fiction, it couldn't get any more weird.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I said. And then it gets better. And then
there's more.
That's right. So then his wife Olga, who was left behind, to some degree, she picks up the reins of his empire and is involved with that. The DEA presses charges against her. She's facing time in prison, so she becomes a federal informant. Helps a DEA agent by the name of Don Lincoln do a really daring undercover operation. And about a year later, when all said and done, based on Olga's information as an informant, they make the largest drug bust in the history of the Mid-Atlantic states in '86. Arrest 12 international drug traffickers from out of the country who were just moving amazing amounts of drugs into the U.S. Then the book circles back, and there's the question: is Wally Thrasher still alive? Maybe living on a beach island in the Caribbean. He'd be 80 now. So it's got a pretty cool little D.B. Cooper element.
It sure sounds like a great story. So was Olga not on board with the faked death part of the story?
She, by all indications, she was not. I spent a lot of time interviewing her. She was very forthcoming, shared a lot of information. She believes that Wally is dead. She believed the crash was real. She knew the death certificate was fake, but I guess without giving too much away, it was a little bit complicated. The happy ending to the story is she lived the rest of her life on the straight and narrow, was very successful, raised two kids that are very successful now. In fact, Wally Thrasher's son, who was 6 years old at the time of his alleged death, Montana Thrasher, is now a police officer in Georgia. Also, he's done a lot of investigating and shared a lot of his information with me in writing the book. And they both wanted the story told, the good, the bad, and the ugly about the squirrel.
That is fascinating.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't want it to go past unnoticed that Montana Thrasher is a really cool name.
Oh my God,
Isn't
that's
that
a great
cool?
name.
Yes,
Sounds like
indeed.
a professional wrestler.
Yeah. And if you Google Wally Thrasher's name, there's one of the things that will come up is a YouTube clip of an unsolved mystery segment from the 90s that featured him on the television show Unsolved Mysteries, and now also America's Most Wanted. So he was quite the resources were put into finding Wally Thrasher.
It sounds like a great book. I cannot wait to read this. So when will this come out?
Still undergoing a final round of publishing with my editor. We're hoping by the end of March, early April. But
that's great.
There's thank you. There's a website, chasingthesquirrelbook.com, and then it's also on social media, on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And I'll be announcing the release date as we get closer.
I was picturing you, and the idea for Chasing the Squirrel came up. I was picturing you responding, yeah, I'll write anything as long as I don't have to interview 100 people.
And full disclosure, I say interview. A lot of those were just short phone conversations, maybe half hour or an hour. A lot of the interviews weren't actually sitting down with people, but I do make a point to say there were over 100 sources.
That is amazing. You had mentioned that you do occasionally do events, live events regarding the book. Do you have any local events that are coming up that anyone who's listening here locally could go to?
I don't have any set up yet, but I will, both in Hampton Roads, where I'm from, as well as out in Southwest Virginia, where it's funny, but he's a folk hero of sorts. I hate to say that about a marijuana smuggler, but in Roanoke in Southwest Virginia, there's still a lot of people that talk about him. So, yeah, I'll definitely be doing some of those events. Some of the law enforcement officers who pursued him, there's a U.S. Marshal and also a state police special agent who are going to come to some of those events, and they'll share some of their stories that didn't make the book about doing that. And then also, I think down in Atlanta, his son, Montana, who shared a lot of his info with the book, will be talking a little bit about his father. He was 6 years old when his father disappeared or died, but I think he's going to help me promote the book at some appearances down in Atlanta as well.
Part of me wants to still picture Wally Thrasher with a drink with an umbrella on it on some tropical beach somewhere.
Absolutely.
I guess
yes,
it's possible.
It is indeed. Yeah, he was a very resourceful guy. It's when you read the book and hear some of the stories about him, you can see. And an interesting thing, in that time frame, the 70s and the 80s, there were more than a few people in the drug trade who are believed to have disappeared and left the country and have not been seen again. So he would not be.
That is unreal.
Yeah.
And we would love it if you would come back on Mind Over Murder and talk to us more about Wally Thrasher once the book comes out.
Absolutely. It would be an honor.
He sounds like a fascinating character, and we know it's going to be a terrific book. On a little bit more serious note, as you move forward with the television limited series or documentary, do you think that you and Scott McTavish will revisit the idea of interviewing Stephen Epperly?
Definitely. I'm sure that we will. You always try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And certainly if I were him, I'd want a chance to tell my side of the story. I would hope he'd do that. Yeah, I think a fresh approach to him, I would certainly hope that he would be willing to share any information he has, for sure.
Where is he currently incarcerated?
Gosh, he's been all over the state. Gosh, just about any prison you can imagine. But the last I heard, he was at Buckingham Prison. He was several years ago was at Bland County Correctional Facility, which is in Southwest Virginia. It was close to his home where he was from. And it's a medium security prison for someone on a life sentence for murder to be at. And then got in some trouble there, among other things, possession of contraband. It was sent to Buckingham. I think this was about 3 or 4 years ago, which is a more maximum security prison with less privilege and certainly a worse environment.
And he's got to be like 68 years old or so now?
Yeah, he is 66, the last I checked. He came up for parole this past summer for geriatric parole and was denied parole. He'll come back up again for parole in another 3 years. The parole board, the book gets into that a little bit. It's a 5-person board appointed by the governor of Virginia. You need 3 out of 5 votes to be paroled. So the Hall family, obviously, as well as just about everyone else I've talked to, are adamant that he not get parole. So every time he comes up, they're just deluged with letters, a lot of letters insisting that he not be given parole, and have fortunately followed through on that.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, too, was this dynamic where you've had access to both sides of the prosecution, both the prosecution and the defense, as well as the investigators and so on. What's the dynamic like for his 2 former defense attorneys when they come out and they speak about the case? Are they limited in what they can say? He sounds, guilty as hell, but they obviously had to provide a vigorous defense. That's their job. How much are they able to say, or what's their tone like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't been asked that, and I'm glad you asked it. The 2 attorneys, the one in particular, Dave Warburton, who's still in private practice in Pulaski with an office not far from where it was back in 1980, he is very quick to point out that he can't talk about certain things due to attorney-client privilege. In fact, I made the mistake of referencing the body in my questions to him, and he said, when you say the body, I can't even acknowledge that there was a body. And so I said, okay.
That's interesting.
That's interesting. Yeah.
He shares a lot of vignettes from it. And then the other attorney, Woody Lookabill, who later became a judge, who's now a retired judge, but was just an outstanding judge, circuit court judge in that part of the state. He'll share a little more. For example, he, in one of the presentations we gave at Radford University for the Criminal Justice Department, he acknowledged the body and even presented a theory on where he thought it.
Where did he think it was?
Someone he knew who he felt had some credibility said that Epperly burnt it up in an incinerator in Radford. Yeah, which is terrible to think of for many reasons. So, yeah, Woody Lookabill will talk a little more about it. What I did not realize until I really wrote the book and had an understanding is that they both did an outstanding job representing him, and the case was scrutinized, went through a series of about 6 state and federal appeals, with the Virginia Supreme Court, and then went to the Federal Court of Appeals. And the conviction was upheld every step of the way due to the fact that they did such an outstanding job representing. That was their job to do it, and they certainly did a great job.
This other person that you suspect may have been involved in moving the body and helping dispose of it. I was very excited reading the book when you mentioned several people that might have provided him some level of assistance. And then, of course, I'm disappointed as I continue reading and discover they're deceased. And so you're always like, let down. Do you think there's any possibility that his possible accomplice, could still be alive and out there and carrying around this information?
I think that's a good possibility. Yeah, as well as another scenario I envision is the person that a lot of the investigators and police officers point to as the most likely accomplice. It was a guy named Tom Hardy, who was a Blacksburg businessman, was heavily involved in the drug trade. In fact, a lot of people suspect that Epperly was not involved in using drugs, he may have been the muscle for this guy's drug sales operation. But at any rate, Tom Hardy was someone, he drank a lot, he did a lot of drugs, and I think there's a chance when he was in that state of mind, either drunk or high at some point, people talk, he may have said something to somebody at a party somewhere, and that person doesn't even know it's relevant to the case.
So even though Hardy himself is dead, you think that if Hardy shared information while intoxicated with someone, that person could come forward and at least give an indication of what Hardy said back then? Yes,
I think there's a possibility of that, and then several law enforcement officers have said it too, so it's not an original thought by any means, but from me, so yes.
If we do have any listeners, because a number of people have actually brought this up to us and said, hey, when are you guys going to cover the Gina Renee Hall case? If there's anyone listening who does have information that they feel might be of value, who should they send that to?
The Virginia State Police, I'll post on the website and the social media contact information. It's been too long since I've done that, but I'll share that. But just a general call to the Virginia State Police would be good for that.
And
absolutely.
We're happy to share that in our what we call our show notes for the podcast. If there's a specific office or phone number they should be contacting or email, we're happy to include that because you never know. As Kristin said, somebody out there might know something.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you both know, too, there's a good chance someone has a piece of information and they don't even know that it's critical. It's something that they think is just trivial when in reality it could be a missing piece of the puzzle.
Ron, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and sharing your wonderful stories, both about the Gina Renee Hall case and the Wally Thrasher case.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and best of luck to you both. I really enjoy your podcast as well.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. You can listen to Mind Over Murder on any of your favorite podcast platforms. And a reminder that we're a new podcast and we very much appreciate your subscriptions and your kind comments and reviews.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time. Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.